Thank you. So moving on. Always like to start a conversation with an opening to ground ourselves. And I'm going to use a poem called The Eagle Poem by Joy Harjo, our National Poet Laureate, to help us get in a space to receive new information, to enhance the information that we have, and have us basically have this be a time of nurturing for us, not just talking heads spewing information. Okay, so the poem. To pray, you open your whole self, to sky, to earth, to sun, to moon, to one whole voice that is you, and know that there is more that you can't see, can't hear, can't know except in moments steadily growing and in languages that aren't always sound, but other circles of motion. Like eagle that Sunday morning over Salt River, circled in blue sky and wind, swept our hearts clean with sacred wings. We see you, we see ourselves, and know that we must take the utmost care and kindness in all things. Breathe in, knowing we are made of all of this, and breathe, knowing we are truly blessed because we were born and die soon within a true circle of motion, like eagle rounding out the morning inside of us. We pray that it will be done in beauty, in beauty. Thank you guys for indulging me. So as was said earlier, please feel free to interrupt me in the chat. I will have a couple of places where I'll pause and ask for comments and questions. But if I'm not disrupted or interrupted, or if I don't find it rude at all, so please just jump right in if you have anything that you'd like, make a statement, quote a poem, whatever it is you want to do that's relevant to the conversation. I hope you bring that forward. So I want to talk a little bit about who the National Native Children's Trauma Center is and what we do. So since 2007, we've been funded as a treatment and services adaptation center in the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. The network was funded by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration to address the impacts of exposure to violence back in the day. And it started out in the early 2000s. We were Category 3, which is a direct service trauma center funded for that. And that was the conversation around mental health parity and also 9/11, when even our president was looking at the impacts of witnessing the towers fall night after night on the news. So all of the other professionals in the field said, oh, it's not just terrorist attacks, it's witnessing domestic violence, it's being a victim of violence. And it's not just adults, it's children too. It's infants, children, and adolescents that are, homelessness is an issue. Think of all of the kinds of traumatic events that can happen in an individual's life. Let's talk about that, and let's talk about the impacts on individuals' educational outcomes, their health outcomes, their well-being outcomes. So we started out, as I said, as a Category 3, which is a direct service. And we're in the College of Education at the University of Montana for, as I said earlier, reasons that no longer remain relevant in my mind. But at the time, in the early 2000s, school administrators and school teachers around Montana were reaching out to the College of Ed and saying, you know what, we have a lot of students that are getting diagnosed with ADD or ADHD, and they're exhibiting these kinds of behaviors. And the strategies that we've been taught to support them in classrooms don't seem to work. And the medication that they've been prescribed doesn't seem to work either. What else could it be? And so the Dr. Daryl Stoley, who was with the center at that time, began to look around the country to say, what looks like ADD or ADHD, and came across the idea or the notion or the examples of childhood traumatic stress look like ADD. It's like basically PTSD in children and adolescents, and there's no criteria for it. So we just call it childhood traumatic stress. So that thought, oh, that sounds reasonable. Okay, so that's why they're blowing out of classrooms. That's why they're having difficulty maintaining and sustaining in the classroom, being attentive, not being disruptive, that sort of thing. And so he looked around the country again, found the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, found Dr. Marlene Wong at the Los Angeles Unified School District in LA, and they had developed something called cognitive behavioral intervention for trauma in schools. Not the kinds of trauma that you might experience in schools, like a shooting or bullying, but that was the setting with which they would provide that trauma intervention. And it's sort of like, well, this was developed for urban Latino adolescents. Well, a rural reservation American Indian population, well, our kids, benefit from this same treatment. So we asked them, tell us about your kids, what kind of that are in these CBITS groups. So, well, they're often living in households with chronic poverty, generational poverty. They're living in households where they are witnessing family violence. They're living in households where a caregiver is impaired either because of mental health issues like PTSD or depression or substance use disorders. A parent might be in prison. A parent might be deceased. That sort of thing. So, as they described their kids, it was like, yep, our kids too in Montana. So, okay, let's give this a go. Being good researchers, we asked the question first, do American Indian adolescents suffer from childhood traumatic stress symptoms, first of all? And if they do, will an evidence-based treatment model that was developed for an urban Latino population work in a rural reservation population? And the answer we found to both of those questions was yes, very high rates of traumatic stress. And yes, the CBITS model did work to reduce their symptoms. In fact, the rates were so high that we had to take the CBITS model, the cognitive behavioral intervention, which is a small group, 8 to 10 students over a 10-week period, take that and take all the therapeutic pieces out and leave in the socio-emotional learning about trauma. This is what it is. This is what it looks like. This is what it feels like. This is what you can do about it. And we created Students Trauma and Resilience, or STAR. So because in a middle school with 100 students and you have one school counselor, you cannot, and 70 students are in need of some kind of intervention, we had an ethical responsibility to respond to that kind of need. And so we thought, well, let's get a coach or a music teacher or a principal or a math teacher that's psychologically minded to be able to do this curriculum in a classroom with these students in order to give some sorts of supports to these students. The first study was interesting because the students started to tell us that, watching mom and dad fight was hard, but grandma dying was harder. Their favorite uncle dying in a car wreck because he was under the influence is harder. My best friend dying by suicide is harder. And so for some of us that were in thinking child welfare versus education, we're thinking it might have been a red herring, that these students might their families might be sort of in touch with justice or in touch with child welfare at some point in their lives. And so they're going to be very protective. So we did a second study and we found out, which was very cutting edge back then, not so much anymore, but way back then, that for American Indian adolescents, grief and loss accounted for their PTSD-like symptoms or their childhood traumatic stress just as much as exposure to violence. So that really kind of changed the conversation for us and tribal communities, because we now no longer had to pathologize parents, right? What's happening in your household and your kid's so stressed out, right? And being able to say, it seems like, Johnny is really struggling with grandma's death and uncle's death and his friend's death. And they would go, oh yeah. So they were much more likely to give parental permission for them to join such a group. What we found out though, as did the rest of the network, is that you really can't embed a trauma treatment model in the context of a system, a building, an agency that isn't trauma informed. And so in 2007, we applied for the Category 2 funding because we were better at training and technical assistance than we were at scaffolding up a treatment model in a school system. And so we began to do that sort of systems change. And we started going into tribal communities, and we'd have tribal leadership, whoever brought us in, tribal leadership would see our presentation on the impacts of trauma, and they'd say, we need to see this is schools. or we would be brought in by the schools and we would do training and what the impacts of trauma. And they say, you know, who really needs to see this is the courts. You know, JDC, juvenile detention, child welfare, you know, that emergency department, they really treat people badly. So you see the picture that if today in 2021, we are somewhere in the United States working with a tribe in any one of the systems that touch the life of a child in a community. So that's what we do. And we've taken the CBITS model and culturally adapted it for American Indian, Alaska Native communities and populations. And we also have adapted some training curriculums to better support tribes in the community. We're working very hard to support training of trainers, because in rural reservation communities that we work with anyway, we do work with some urban settings, but the bulk of what we do is rural. There really isn't maybe a master's level or a PhD level person who can do that. So let's get the natural helpers. Let's bring in those people that are already doing good work in their community. Let's train them in how to do a training in what is trauma and what we can do about it. And so that's the work that we've been doing. And as you see, our mission is to be very respectful. We have all heard of university researchers behaving badly in Indian country, you know, helicoptering in, extracting data, helicoptering out, creating careers for themselves without the benefit to the community. And because we are tribal members at NNCTC, we don't want to behave that way, obviously, right? So that's a big piece of the work. We honor tribal sovereignty, and we go in and we do the work the way the tribe wants us to do the work. If they say you work with this agency, that's who we work with. We don't presume to tell them how to make changes in their own community. So I'm just going to briefly go over what is trauma. I'm sure you all know, but let's just give it a good brushstroke here. It is an experience of real or perceived threat to your life or safety, or the life or safety of a loved one, that causes an overwhelming sense of helplessness or horror or terror. So all of us, all 114 of us on this call, respectively in our offices, in our bedrooms, wherever we are, in our cars, something could happen where it was if we were all in the same room at a conference, maybe the floor fell out and we all dropped 4 feet. Some of us sprained our ankle, some of us broke a wrist, that sort of thing. In 6 weeks, all of us may have a different response to that event. So I might think, oh my gosh, God is good. You know, I bounced, yay. Somebody else might have thought to themselves, I can't go into a conference room again. It was so terrifying. I didn't think we were going to stop at 4 feet. I thought we were going to die, right? I was sure of it. So it's really about the person's perception of the event. So, and we like to tell parents, and we like to tell legislators, whether they're tribal or state or federal, you can't ever say to anyone, well, that happened to me and I'm okay, so you'll be okay too, right? It's all in perception of the individual, and no one's weak for having a much more impactful negative impact response than anyone else. It's just all kinds of factors lead into that. So that's trauma. There are types of trauma, obviously. There's acute, which is a single event. It's Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Ida. It's a house fire, a car wreck, a blizzard, you know, that maybe cost some lives. But that's usually not who we're talking about when we're talking about our clients, our patients, or our students. We're usually talking about chronic trauma. It happens multiple times. It might be the same events that's repeated sexual abuse, repeated neglect, food insecurity, that sort of thing. And then there's complex, is what we're mostly talking about, which is that ongoing trauma exposure, and it's long-term. But key to this one is it's very often at the hands of our caregivers. So those people that are meant to protect us and nurture us and help us grow are the ones who are inflicting the trauma, the violence or the neglect on us. And that becomes very complex, and it really impacts the development of infants, children, adolescents. And we know from the ACEs study later on in middle age, it still impacts health outcomes. Of course, if we're going to talk about American Indian and Alaska Native people, we have to talk about historical trauma. And understanding that historical trauma really happened. Colonization did have a negative impact on tribes. There was the genocidal intent experienced by tribes based on our collective identity as tribes. Today, there's over 574 federally recognized tribes. I believe there's somewhere between 300 and 400 state recognized tribes, but that's what exists today. There are nations that literally no longer exist because of colonization. Their languages aren't heard in the earth. Their songs aren't heard. Their foodways aren't known. Their medicines aren't known. They have just been annihilated. So it has had an impact on us collectively as a people. And I really want us to understand that we have to not just, do trauma assessments with a client, like give me your trauma history, but we have to be really aware of our community history with trauma, especially for tribal people. And really understanding that tribes have a political relationship and identity. We have a trust relationship with the federal government. We are a nation to nation relationship, right? We're not just a race or an ethnicity. We have signed over 400 treaties and none of them have been honored fully, ever. So there's that political identity. And so it's those, and there's those political strategies used that were used to either annihilate us or assimilate us that had really negative impact. And of course, we know about the smallpox blankets purposefully, the diseases, removal of children to boarding schools, the 50s and 60s scoop and child welfare, removing children from their tribes. And later on, the relocation of tribal people into urban settings allegedly in order to create opportunity. There was not much created. So there is a psychological response that tribal people had to those sorts of strategies that were detrimental to them. There are many of us that believe that the boarding school experience has taken generations of our children and away from us, away from understanding or experiencing their loving, warm, nurturing cultural environments and parenting ways, and put it in harsh environments of deprivation, both physical and emotional and psychological warmth, or caring, that sort of thing. Education in the early days wasn't so much about education so much as it was about being a workforce for the local community and then learning about Christianity. So it's had a huge psychological impact. Thinking about my Dakota name is her Lightning Bear Nose Woman. And if Lightning Bear Nose Woman leaves at 5 and comes back as Marilyn, I come back to a family and a community that I don't understand and know. And so I was isolated and mistreated there, but I come back to a community where I continue to feel isolation, where I continue to not have connection with my family or my community. And then I marry someone, or I have a child with someone, and we raise our child the only way we know how, which is in that very boarding school, authoritarian, harsh way of parenting. So that's that in a small, that's a very, very, very pinpoint definition of what the impacts of boarding school. There's been some research on it that, we asked the question, does it really matter what happened to great-great-grandma? Does it really impact my well-being today? And so Les Whitback out of the University of Iowa and his colleagues created a grief and loss scale. And they asked tribal elders and tribal adolescents, do you ever think about the loss of spirituality, culture, language, tribal ways or whatever? And they were like, yeah, we do all the time. In fact, almost 50% of us think about those losses every single day in this country. But then they said, okay, you think about them a lot, but do you have any emotional feeling about them? How do you respond to them? And the answer to those questions was startling, in that they felt depression, sadness, anger, hurt. They felt like it was happening all over again. in very high rates. So it's that collective trauma that we carry with us and continue, and they feel like it's continuing today. I always give the example of my relatives and my friends down in Pine Ridge, where every single day they drive by Wounded Knee, right? The mass grave at Wounded Knee, where their relatives, their grandmothers and their grandfathers and their aunties and uncles and were murdered by the cavalry and dumped into that mass grave. And they go to the grocery store having to pass by there. They go to school, go to work, go to ball games, having to pass by that event. So it does have an impact. And really understanding that tribal communities is that we say this a lot, like it takes a village to raise a child, but when one of us is wounded or hurting, it really does impact the well-being of all of us. And that is a big piece of the conversation in Indian country. The good news is that not only did we have experienced that trauma, but the good news is that potentially we can do a collective healing. We can heal collectively, as not just as individuals and not just as families, but as entire communities. And that's the work that I hope that I get to witness and have been witnessing in the last 10 years. Here's Teresa Evans Campbell has a different definition than Marie Braveheart's definition. It's just basically a complex trauma inflicted on a group of people with a shared group identity. It's the legacy of numerous traumatic events over generation, and encompasses the psychological and social responses that we had to those events. So here it is. There's what we think is most. So again, consequences of can be effective or destructive parenting, authoritarian or inconsistency and rejecting of the child, insensitivity to the child's needs, lack of parental involvement or bonding, poor school relations for obvious reasons, weak spiritual foundations. If I left, understanding my Dakota ways, my Dakota creation stories and my songs and my ceremonies, and then I'm basically steeped in Catholicism and I come back, I'm not really believing all of Catholicism. I'm not really believing all of Dakota ways. So what do I believe and how do I do this? Again, unhealthy family norms and weak ethnic identity. So perspective. The reason that we want to talk about historical trauma in the context of working with American Indian or Alaska Native individuals and communities is that we have to really be cognizant of that historical trauma lens. And so how do we view collective behavior? As a tribal member, I'm not interested in pathologizing my people in particular, but American Indians in general, right? But very often I'm in spaces where I might not look classically Native, right? So people think that they can say things in front of me, at least they do in Montana, non-tribal members. And so they will talk about some of the political decisions or some of the behaviors of tribal folks in their communities, and they are not helpful. They're not respectful. They're very pathologizing. They're very racist, stigmatizing. So I want us to take that, to use historical trauma as that lens to really, how do we view these communities? How do we, and give them a sort of a, give them the kudos that we are still here. We have survived. They are still here. They're still making decisions. We're still raising our children, getting educated, still involved in our spiritual ways and our cultural ways. And so to really honor that sort of strength and that resiliency. Of course, I talked about the ACEs study earlier. Everybody's heard about that. That really helped the conversation, I think, for all people to think about the impacts of trauma on our physical well-being. It's like, if my DNA, my genes respond differently to different stimuli because of my trauma, right? It's a physical reaction. I can't control it. Therefore, we can't blame. Like, you guys just need to pull yourselves up by your bootstraps, get over it, move on, right? Whatever. But what ACEs didn't do is, of course, is look at the social context or the local context for a lot of people, and did not look at historical trauma. Okay, can't find my little, there it is. So I can't tell how fast I'm going, so please monitor my time for me, Widja. Thank you so much. There have been studies in Indian country around ACEs. I just want to bring to your attention this particular study that focuses on an American Indian sample of 1,600 enrolled tribal members from 7 different tribes. In the original ACEs study, the respondents had at least 63.9, almost 64%, had at least one ACE. For American Indians, we have 86% of us are reporting at least one adverse childhood experience. In the original study, 12.5% answered that they had 4 or more ACEs, whereas 33% of the American Indian population have 4 or more ACEs. So you can see that our exposure to traumatic events is much higher. And I would correlate that has a much bigger impact on our well-being because of the exposure. So now, before we get started on having a conversation about how to do this or what it looks like, I want us to have a client named Julia. She's 22. She's the mother of 2 children under the age of 3. She's been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes and obesity. She smokes and describes herself as a social drinker. The children's father is 20 years old. They both live with his mother. Grandmother is often the primary caregiver to the children. Julia was arrested for a DUI and is now being evaluated for substance abuse, and social services was called because the children were with her at the time of her arrest. That's what you know. Here's what you don't know. Julia's drinking is chronic. She's using alcohol to cope with a verbally and emotionally abusive partner. Her children rarely sleep, and the 3-year-old is already engaging in challenging behaviors. She was raised in a chaotic household and was bullied by her siblings and later bullied in school. Julia was molested by a relative in childhood and raped at 17 years of age. Julia has graduated from high school but struggles to attend her college classes. She hopes to earn a bachelor's degree in business administration. Julia is a gifted quilt maker and crafting beaded jewelry. She supplements her income by selling her quilts and her beadwork. That's what you don't know as she comes into your services. So now, let's think about Julia, or if you've got a client that you're thinking about, use that client too. So these are the kinds of stigmatizing behaviors that professional caregivers can do without even realizing it. So it's maybe she didn't say this to Julia, this social service provider, but if she has this attitude, right, it's going to show up every time they have a meeting. So obviously, she doesn't care about her kids, or she'd get sober, right? Why would she be driving around drinking with her kids in the car? That's so dangerous, making all of those kinds of judgments. So let's think about why people drink, may be drinking or may be abusing drugs and alcohol. So let's look at sexual and physical abuse of women in general in the United States. So we do know that 50 to 80% of women have been diagnosed with a serious mental illness, that 55 to 99% of those women are also addicted to substances. 90% of women with alcoholism were sexually abused or suffered severe violence from their parents. 92% of incarcerated girls report sexual, physical, or severe emotional abuse. And as many as a third of the women and 14% of survivors of child sexual abuse. Of all women. These are old stats. I was sick all last week and most of this week, as you can tell by my voice probably. So these are old stats that I haven't renewed, but let me just look at in 2008, the CDC, 39% of Native women surveyed identified as victims of intimate partner violence. In 2006, 6% of American Indian respondents who had been a victim of rape or sexual assault had experienced other physical abuse. 2004 study that examined intimate partner rape among American Indian women found that 1 in 5 respondents reported that they'd been a victim of at least one incident in their lifetime. And during a physical assault, American Indian and Alaska Native women were more likely to be injured than women of all other groups. And there's a study it looks at why they are more likely to become have injuries. And it's really often about the attitudes that Indian women versus white women have around violence. So in the particular study I'm talking about, the white women would call when there was a verbal threat of violence, would call 911. Native women wouldn't call unless something was bleeding or broken. So they're experiencing high rates of violence, but their children are also witnessing really high rates of physical violence also. So I'm hoping to have all kinds of caregivers wherever they meet the life of a young mom know that to really think about the kinds of lives that their clients or their patients or their students might be living at the time or have lived in the past. So these are all quotes that I've actually heard with my own 2 ears. What gets me angry is that it doesn't seem to matter. They just don't give a shit about themselves or their kids. I end up spending my time treating them instead of helping patients who really need my help. Again, we bring our attitudes into the services that we provide. He didn't know anything about trauma. So, so these women are using alcohol and drugs to cope. And I'm focusing on women because that's usually the primary caregiver. I'm not trying to, not saying that young fathers don't have these same experiences or grandparents don't have these same experiences, but let's just focus on moms. There's a lot to get help, right? They have to walk through all of the stigma and shame of service providers, the judgmental attitudes by service providers, by their own families, the punitive approaches that we have to providing services. I used to work for primary health on my reservation 35 years ago, and I was not trauma informed, obviously. And I can just remember thinking to myself, okay, your third appointment. Oh no, we made a rule. Your third appointment, you missed your third appointment. You do not get to make another appointment until 3 months from now. And then you better show up. Again, women often, their own relatives, their own community have a sexualized image or version of who they are. They are perceived as promiscuous. And that brings a lot of shame for a lot of young moms. Obviously believing themselves to be failures that don't deserve help. Again, that powerlessness, that helplessness, that hopelessness. They won't reach out very often if they haven't lost their children for fear of losing their children. So they're caught between a rock and a hard place. It's like, I need help, but if I admit that I need help, what's going to happen to my kids? What kind of investigation is going to be started? And then the anger and blame of service providers that they experience. In really thinking about the work that we do, one of the things that we've been doing a lot is we're training providers to think about, systems change. How can we change our policies and procedures to be much more thoughtful and kind to our clients, our patients? And how can we change our attitudes? And how do we look at those behaviors and, look at them through a trauma lens? But what we haven't really done in treatment, I don't think, is look at the trauma histories of young moms, their own trauma histories, and how that impacts their parenting, even without the alcohol and drugs, right? So not only just shame and guilt and remorse for past behaviors of poor parenting, but there's those traumatic memories that are stimulated for them by their kids, right? I had a client once who had done really brilliant work. She was a child sexual abuse survivor, and she was in her early 30s, and she was just a phenomenal young woman. And part of her way of taking care of herself was she walked 5 miles every day around. It was a 5-mile square that she walked around. And she left one day to take her walk, and she left late in the day. It was like early September, and it was getting dark earlier. And she miscalculated the time. So she's about 2 blocks from her house. And all of a sudden, the street lights come on. There's a powwow happening in her community, and it's down below by the river. And she can hear the drums, and she can smell burning leaves. And all of a sudden, she's gripped with fear. Her chest tightens, her eyes dilate. She leaves the sidewalks and starts walking in the middle of the road. She starts looking around and looking over her shoulder, but she's well enough to say to herself, what's going on? Why am I all of a sudden so fearful? Bessel van der Kolk says that the body remembers trauma, right? This was the body remembering what she had not forgotten, but she had thought she was healed of, was that her last assault was at that particular powwow when she was 12. And it was very violent and it was very dramatic. And it was dark and she could smell the burning leaves and she could hear the powwow drums, and nobody could hear her screams because of the loudness of the powwow drums. And so all of those years later, in her early 30s, her body responded and reacted to that trigger. And so when she came back in to see me the following week, she told me the story, and it was just, it's really our traumatic memories are stimulated, and we don't necessarily go, oh gosh, that's because I was treated like that, or oh gosh, that's because I was feeling like that. Because I think children engage in behaviors that are really challenging for parents. So this was the kicker. She also, her daughter's 5th birthday, she said, I went home and I looked at my little girl and she turned 5, and I thought to myself, there is nothing provocative or sexual about my 5-year-old daughter, right? No, of course not. But she had to see that to make that correlation. She had a physical trigger, and then she had a sort of, there's this residue of, I thought I really did kind of blame myself for this. Oh, okay. So anyway, they trigger each other. Traumatized parents trigger their kids they traumatize, and the kids trigger them, whether it's their behaviors, their ages, words that they say, foods that they like or dislike, colors that they love, whatever. So also they lack exposure very often to good parenting models, and often engaged in sort of coercive or punitive parenting. And then again, it's really difficult when you have a trauma history and you're not aware of it and you're not beginning to heal it, be able to regulate your own emotions, to do some self-soothing that doesn't require cigarettes or alcohol or drugs. And very often in the past, and they continue to make really poor judgments about the safety for their kids, like letting their kids go with unsafe relatives that they know are unsafe, or themselves, allowing themselves to be in unsafe circumstances because they think they need the ride to the store, right, to get the groceries. They make those kinds of decisions out of their trauma histories, not because they're stupid or incapable. So what are some of the supports that are needed? And the reason, I guess I forgot to say this, the reason I want to focus a little bit on addiction and recovery is, as I said, I guess I did say it earlier, is because that's who I work with. In JDC, it was always a kid in possession, of a drug and alcohol. In child welfare, in the courts, always, dad, drunk and disorderly, mom, not there, that sort of thing. So again, here's what they need. They need some empathy. They need some self-forgiveness. They need to be able to walk through and honestly look at the impact on their children. And they need to be able to parent differently. They need to be able to begin to heal from their own traumas, recognize their own triggers, and be able to lean into affect management and caregiving in a way that is supportive of their children rather than detrimental. Mothers in recovery. I felt like everybody's against me, my family, the social worker, the courts. I wanted to get clean, but I didn't know how. How was I supposed to make up for all the shit I did when I was using? In 15 or 18 months, right? Trauma and recovery. So you all know this, changes in roles and relationships among family members. Once you start to get sober and you start to get well, suddenly, your 8-year-old doesn't like it that you're going to tell her what to do when she's been telling everybody else what to do in the household. Having to deal with the guilt and remorse for your past behaviors, thinking about the fear and loss. You get sober and suddenly you don't have any friends, and you need friends. And then the kinds of triggers that you experience and your traumatic memories that you experience, you can't numb them now. So you really need to feel those feelings. And honestly, it really requires support. Again, back to the parents' trauma histories and their ability to parent in a nurturing way. There is a lack of ability to tolerate a child's sadness, anxiety, or aggression. The child is a reminder or a trigger. Behaviors and attitude develop as attempts to cope negatively. So again, isolation, distancing, distrust of self. I know a lot of moms that, get clean and they're living with their mom, and I talk to their mom and it's sort of like, well, she's always in the back bedroom sleeping, or she's in the back bedroom reading. And she's self-isolating. She doesn't trust herself. She had a belief that she can't do it. And that, so she thinks the best thing to do is just distance herself from her children and her family. There is a community-based intervention that looks at and approaches moms with trauma histories and addresses the trauma history, and it's called Mom Power. I threw this in here because I did a lit review, a little bit of a lit review, trying to find some sort of non-heavy duty therapy. Like it's a curriculum, it's done in a group setting, it's done in community. It doesn't have to necessarily have a PhD or MSW. It can be done with food and other kinds of things, with bringing the kids along. And so just wanted you guys to be able to see it here, and then so you can access it at your leisure to take a look at it. Mom in recovery. I felt like the judge cared about me and my kids. She didn't make me feel like a total failure. So that's basically what trauma-informed care or services are. It's just, being a little more empathetic. It's really understanding those problem behaviors of your clients or your patients or your students. The manifestations of the trauma can look really, they engage in really unhelpful behavior. And it's not that they're being a stinker or they're a bad person. They have been triggered, or they are triggered coming into the service setting. Maybe the service setting is a trigger itself. Maybe they were, in care as a child. And so the fact that they have to, work with child welfare again as a parent is just overwhelming. Okay, so here's what happened. So I didn't know anything about trauma, right? So when people don't show for appointments, or they seem initially to really engage in, this relationship that's going to benefit them, and then they suddenly drop out, that has probably a lot to do with their trauma history. So can anyone give an example of a professional experience where they initially maybe were reluctant to engage, or they did engage and then they quickly dropped out? And you can write it in chat. I know, right? So many. Yeah. Well, I really want to know what happened in that shelter, right? What triggered it? What's the deal? What happened that she suddenly doesn't feel like she's worth the effort to meet with her case manager? Yeah, thanks, Emery. One more. Yeah, video visits are necessary because of COVID, but they can be they don't feel very supportive sometimes, right? Yeah. I feel like thanks, Emily. I feel like a lot of that has to do with sometimes the parenting that they're experiencing. The parents want to call the police every time they won't get up and go to school or something like that, rather than she was aware enough to call you, Jade. That's absolutely wonderful. Wonderful, wonderful. Thanks, you guys. Appreciate it so much. And then you've already answered the question that trauma has often occurred in that service setting, right? So they've experienced those, what they perceive as coercive practices or activities that have triggered their traumatic trauma reactions. And unfortunately, that's where a lot of their trauma comes from. Here's an interesting slide that I just love to show people, because I'll just give the example of working in healthcare. When I was working 35 years ago, we would be overwhelmed with, flu season would come and we would have like 60 patients in the waiting room, all 8 hours trying to get people seen. And I had no idea the impact of being ignored, right? I'd leave the nurse's station to go to pharmacy, and I would just, turn away and look at the floor because I didn't want to make eye contact with a patient, because I didn't know what to do, because they were looking at me like, when am I going to get in? And some of them were like, help me. And then others were angry and hostile. And I didn't really, I didn't know what to do. So we now know being ignored causes the same chemical reaction in the brain as experiencing physical injury, right? It hurts deeply. So being on time is going to be critical with our clients. They engage in irritable, hostile behavior. They miss appointments and court dates. They either, don't show, or they come in a crisis. They might be reluctant to discuss their problems, but then they want to, dump everything on you and tell you everything. And in the, 20 minutes that you have left, this is another one: confusion and poor memory. I can remember during diabetic clinic, doctors coming out of the room saying, I don't know how many times I've told her in the last year how many units of insulin she needs when her blood sugars are at this level. Not understanding that poor memory is a hallmark of having a trauma history. So, right, we're saying, well, you need to, here's the appointment, here's this, here's the court date, here's the blah, blah. It might not be non-compliance. It might be that they are just are being impacted by their trauma. They can get engaged in poor self-care, right? They're just not worth it. And then this is a big one. Another reason that people are really excited about integrated care now is people will not necessarily go to mental health because they don't say I'm depressed, but they say I ache all over. I feel like I'm dying. I don't know what's going on. Yeah, thank you, Emery. Using that word non-compliance is a coercive concept, right? Yeah, well, they're non-compliant, so that's who they are. Yeah. So anyway, the pain issues are real, and it's not necessarily that they're seeking drugs, right? There's real pain happening physiologically. Referrals to other systems, right? Might not be a soft handoff in the past. Still might not be. It might be something that triggers them, and it might be something that you have to be very aware of with a particular client. On how do you do that? How do you refer to people, and how do you introduce your client to that provider that's going to support their food, their healthcare, their education, whatever it might be. Here it is: compliance versus non-compliance. So again, is it non-compliance, or is it a trauma history? Are they in survival mode? All they're trying to do is cope, right? Let me just get through this appointment and get home. Trauma goggles. This is what we need. So there's not a 1, 2, 3, 4 steps to becoming trauma informed. You really have to get a lot of training in what behaviors mean, right? What trauma behaviors manifest, what triggers are, what your triggers are with clients, so that you can do your own affect management, and you can lean into being much more supportive to your triggered client. So it really is about putting those trauma goggles on. So knowing also that to become trauma informed, it can't be just you, right? It can't be, it's got to be your team. It's got to be a team effort. One person doesn't create a trauma-informed person doesn't create a whole trauma-informed culture in your agency. Knowing that trauma knowledge is culture bound, understanding the cultures of the people that you're working with. I know we have Somalian immigrants in Missoula who have come from places of civil war. They've got a different kind of trauma than our American Indian folks in Missoula, right? So trauma knowledge is culture bound. We always have to, of course, really lean into how do we build resiliency. So what's interesting and what's we need to know about Julia is she has some skills. She does quilts and she beads and she's good at it. How do we support her and her efficacy with that to sort of have it bleed out into the other areas of her life? What does that look like for you? The respect that you can give to her, the kudos or acknowledgement of her talents. So it's that piece too. And it's all about building their resiliency. The healing is building resiliency. I know that that's a trigger for me. I recognize it. This is what I feel like. This is my physical response. This is my emotional response. Here's what I can do right now. My kid's tantruming. I've been triggered. What do I do? I am at the place where I can finally do something about that, right? And this work isn't just a single methodology. It's really a multifaceted lens through which we view all behavior. And a big piece of the work of trauma is not just when working with our clients, but understanding our own exposure to traumatic stress or secondary traumatic stress, experiencing that. Colleagues, working with colleagues who are burnt out or are experiencing secondary traumatic stress. It's really, how do we not just view our clients' behavior, but our behavior, our colleagues' behavior, our administration's behavior. So just want to sort of end the last few slides because I don't know what time I have. Is just to really think, go ahead.
I was going to say it's 2:00, so we're doing fine for time. We have
okay. All right. Thinking about the community that you're engaged in, where is the tribal population concentrated in your particular neighborhood, right? What's the visibility of Native people in your urban setting? Are the non-tribal members aware of the presence of Native people in the community? Is the community aware of the issues Native people face in that community? It's really interesting. We had a grad student who was getting his PhD. He was a young Blackfeet man, and he loved nice cars, and he was able to afford nice cars. But the 4 years that he was in town in Missoula at the University of Montana, in those 4 years, he was stopped 27 times by police officers because they thought he stole the car, right? He was racially profiled. That's the kind of issues that people face in Missoula. So what are some of the other issues that Native people face in community? Is there a barrier to housing? Is there a barrier to food? What does that look like? And then where do Native people go for services? Most urban settings have American Indian centers where they can access resources for dental care or health care or mental health care or substance use treatment. And do you know it? And do you have relationship with them? And can you can they be a referral for you, or are they a referral to you? What's their social connection in the community? So finding those kinds of things out can go a long way in you being able to better support clients in your community. Some fundamental questions to ask when you're working with an American Indian population. What are the challenges of the urban and rural tribal people in your communities, right? What are the strengths of the tribal people? What do you know are their strengths? What do you know about is it Ojibwe in Wisconsin? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, great, thank you.
I'm just kidding. There's like 6 Ojibwe tribes. I think 6. There's a Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, Oneida, Menominee, Stockbridge.
Good, excellent. I wasn't going to try to remember. What are the principles that will guide your responses to the needs of your tribal clients and families? Are you going to look for only Western ways of healing? Do you have a link somewhere in your urban setting to cultural interventions, to spiritual interventions? Do they do sweat lodge? Do they do medicine lodge? Do they have naming ceremonies for the youth? And how can you help your clients access those services? And then how will you find support for yourself as you support your patients or clients or students? It's a big piece of the conversation when becoming trauma informed, because a wounded person cannot necessarily provide support and healing for someone else who's wounded until they heal themselves. We don't have to be perfect, but we just got to be aware. There's some personal strategies for engaging with American Indian, Alaska Native patients, clients, students. You have to really honestly be willing to acknowledge your genuine lack of knowledge about Native culture. You don't have to know a lot about Native people. You just have to be sincere in wanting to authentically develop a relationship. And understand that there are differences with American Indian people in their level of identification or connectedness with their culture. So you may have a client who you might suggest, well, they do sweat lodge over on such and such at such and such a place. And the person might laugh and say, I don't do sweat lodge. And that's okay. That's their level of identification. That's the level of connectedness they have to that particular, and they may sort of like, I won't do it in an urban setting, but I'll do it in my tribal community. Or maybe I don't do any of it. Maybe I've taken on Buddhist beliefs and I meditate, right? We just don't know. Really continue to examine your own worldview and challenge your own paradigms about who you are in your positionality in relationship to your American Indian clients. And then engaging in that cultural humility means that if a client says to you, you say, you've done an assessment, you say, I really think you need this sort of treatment. And they say, I'm just going to go home and I'm going to get with my relatives and we're going to do ceremony. Cultural humility says that you should be able to say, that's a good idea, rather than thinking that the only way to get sober, the only way to get clean, right, is to, the only way to heal is to do it in a Western paradigm, Western worldview. Final considerations, and then we can go to questions and comments. You have to keep a rigid state of flexibility always, always, always. You have to adapt your communication and your expectations. And I like to say this, and by adapt, I don't mean in any way to dumb down, right? I have a lot of conversations on the University of Montana campus about how to retain Native American students. And I always begin the conversation by going, well, American Indian students need your support. And all the faculty will nod their heads. I say, so do white students need your support, but it just looks different for some American Indian students. So they're not less than, they're just different than, right? So just lean in and learn how to adapt your communication and your expectations. Be willing to change your process to include accommodating their expressed needs, right? What does that mean? What does that look like? It's not just about, I do have transportation, but I can't tell you that I don't want to leave my child with my mom because my mom lets her brother come over and he's not safe, but I don't want to tell you that because that could get me in trouble, right? All of those sorts of things. Really trying to figure out how to accommodate people's expressed needs and unexpressed needs. And relationship. American Indian people are always looking for a connection. We're always looking for allies who are willing to have a long-term commitment to our care and to support our well-being and our families. We want to be in a mutually respectful relationship. And this last line is basically from a book that is taught in social work here at the University of Montana sometimes, and it's called Research as Ceremony by Sean Wilson. And it really is thinking about that the kind of relationship that you engage with your client, your patient, or your student is really one of ceremony. It's a sacred trust. There's something spiritual that happens in that context. Whether or not you are a very spiritual person or not, for the American Indian, that's what it is, right? So really understand it's ceremony that you're participating in. And I think when we have that mindset, we walk into rooms and spaces in a much more thoughtful, caring way. And it's good for everybody, right? It's not just good for American Indians, but it's good for colleagues and our own children, our own relations, to really understand relationship as a sacred contract. And we really do engage in ceremony when we engage in relationship. And for closing, I'll just ask us to thoughtfully consider this presentation and now open it up to comments and questions or statements or quotes.
Thank you, Dr. Zimmerman. So folks can, if you have questions or want to say something, you can write in the chat, or like I mentioned, use the raise hand function.
I know I did a really broad brush. Catherine Johnson raised her hand.
Go ahead, Catherine.
Thanks. You know what I have the hardest time with when doing, and all of my therapy is with people who've experienced generational trauma, but is getting them to believe that their problems stem from what they experienced and are not a reflection of who they are. Like that takes so much time, and it takes so many exposures to, yeah, it's not you, it's your trauma.
Right. Catherine, what kind of trauma screens do you use?
We use the ACEs, but we also, if we're working with children, we use the UCLA Trauma Reaction Index, and with adults, we use the Adult Trauma Assessment.
Okay. Yeah, I hear you. It's like, yeah, I worked for my tribal health director 20 years ago who said historical trauma, sober up, get a job. So yeah, people come into these relationships and don't believe those sorts of things. So I think that one of the things that might be helpful is to sort of have available what ACEs is in a pamphlet form and how it impacts health outcomes. Right?
I like that idea. Actually, we talk about it a little bit, but we don't have it as a handout to just give to people. I think that's a great idea. Thank you.
So yeah, do you have any sort of screens that play cartoons or anything for kids?
Oh yeah.
In the waiting rooms?
Well, we don't have waiting rooms because we do in-home family therapy.
Oh, okay. Well, there's on YouTube, there's ACEs Connection, and it's a 28-minute video on ACEs that's really, really well done, right? Anybody can understand it. A 9-year-old could understand it, right? And especially, I thanks, Alicia, really outlining, saying this study was done with, you're right, mostly white, middle-class, well-insured people who experience these sort of outcomes. Yes, thank you, Inger. Listen to understand, not to react. There's all kinds of resources that are online. Harvard has some great videos about the impacts of trauma on infants. Harvard Child Trauma or Child Studies Center or something. I don't know, I'm butchering it. Thanks, Catherine. Anyone else?
Hi, Marilyn. I have a question for you. I'm looking maybe for some guidance for us here. I like that you help differentiate that different groups have different collective trauma and it may show up differently for them and that we have to explore that. Could you maybe give some guidance around what maybe I'm a white person coming into doing some work with the culture. I don't know much about what that trauma looked like or how it's really presenting. How could I approach that conversation in a really respectful way? And acknowledging that just talking about it or asking the questions could re-traumatize folks or bring up some of those feelings.
Yeah. So what we have found out is that very often when you want to talk to a client about their trauma histories, they're not reluctant and it's not necessarily triggering. That they're sometimes it's like, oh yeah, thanks for asking. If you do it in a very, non-threatening, supportive way. And I think maybe personal trauma histories, and then maybe acknowledging, like if you're a tribal member, of course, there's that collective, what happened to your tribe and its historical trauma. And they may say, again, it's that identification with or wanting to acknowledge. They may say, oh, that was nothing. That was 100 years ago. Or they may go, yeah. But just don't be surprised by the answer. And if they say, that was 100 years ago, I wouldn't try to convince them.
Yeah.
Just go, oh, okay. But, and then I just think that people are, especially as you just say, some people who experienced what you experienced, right? They often have that. Sometimes they have these kinds of reactions and they're not helpful. Do you ever have these reactions? I think just as simple as that to begin the conversation about trauma.
I like that normalizing of a reaction or a behavior. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
More folks in the chat just talking about ACEs. A video link was shared and a comment from one of our current 4A students about appreciating the information about ACEs. Ellen says appreciating the information about ACEs, not including cultural historical trauma, that she hadn't learned that. So Brittany says or asks, I'm not sure what other states do, but I do think Wisconsin is going in the right direction of bringing up these barriers and issues faced with Native Americans and to incorporate tribal resources. In Wisconsin, DCF requires CPS workers to engage in a Native American training. I guess that's a comment, not a question.
Yeah, great. That's wonderful to hear. I would also like to support ongoing dialogue about working with American Indian clients. The state of Montana had me do training for all of their regions of child welfare workers, state child welfare workers. And I'm telling you, it was enlightening because everybody's on the spectrum of what they know about tribes, and that's fine. But everybody seems to also be on a spectrum about how much they respect or don't respect tribes also. And it was, I just saw a lot of Montana state workers who said, well, yeah, but a lot, and wasn't sort of leaning into the purpose of the training. It was sort of like, I'm not here to give concrete answers because there are none, right? This is a process. This is a way of practice, how we do our practice. There's not a one way to do it, but basically at the core of who you are has got to be open to difference and open to others' experiences and really understanding. Again, I say this all the time, you have to ask the question, what is the function of that behavior that's happening in front of me? And it's not about me, right? What's the function of the behavior, whether you're a teacher, a child welfare worker, a primary care provider, detention worker? Something's happening with this client, student, patient, right? And what's the function? What is it that they do or do not want to do right now? and depersonalizing it. I think it really gets down to it, and then doing good secondary traumatic stress mitigation for yourself and your colleagues and your agency. We don't want to lose child welfare workers after 3 years of practice. We want child welfare workers to flourish and be doing the job in 15, 20 years and doing it effectively, right?
Other comments or questions for Dr. Zimmerman? Do you see a difference in younger versus older generations of Native American clients in their ability to recognize generational trauma and how it has affected them?
Yes, I do. The resiliency of elders, they will they describe it differently than younger people. They will talk about their trauma, but it doesn't seem to have the impact as they talk about it. But it does have on younger clients. Younger clients, depending on their age, let's say college students, American Indian college students, this is what I have to remind social work students here on campus, is that many times those kids, these students are coming from high schools that educated you. And so they have about as much knowledge about tribal history as you do. So therefore, they might be just now, when they start to learn about historical trauma, learn authentic, actual history, not critical race theory, actual history, they can have a different reaction. They can become very angry until they learn how to resolve it, right? So yeah, it does, it can affect them differently. Yes. Rachel says, traumas in the body, recommendations in the field to helping co-regulate. Yeah, no, I think that's brilliant. I do. I used to, when I had adolescents, we would walk, right? Because sitting in a chair isn't always helpful. And when you start seeing them being dysregulated, if you can just get up and walk around the building or down the street, I think it's wonderful. Ashley, also, American Indian people are much better educated. So many of us have college degrees and masters and PhDs, and we come at the notion of historical trauma from a policy perspective, from a government perspective, from law, from mental health, from education. And so we're all trying to address the same issues, often from our different perspectives, and none of them are right and none of them are wrong. It's just everybody's doing what they know to do to address those issues within the context of their own disciplines. So, and you might have two Native folk youth in front of you. One's a college student, or they're both college students, and they have totally different responses to generational trauma. Mostly because, so here's a wonderful example. I have a colleague, we hired her a few years ago. She's Navajo, and she struggles with, when we do trauma trainings, she struggles with the historical trauma conversation. And I just found out why, because Navajo don't really talk about it. And it's not a cultural, at least in her family and in her clan, it's not a cultural norm to talk about the long walk or those kinds of things that they experienced, and how they survived. They keep that pretty quiet. And so she often is very uncomfortable in those settings where she has to talk about it. But not because she has a trauma history, because she was raised in a beautiful, wonderful, nurturing family who loves her, and she's always been supported and loved and cared about, but just because of the cultural norms of having those kinds of conversations that she comes from. And I had never encountered that before. I had with suicide, but not with historical trauma. because I know some Southwest tribes will not say the word. And so when we started to train years ago, we'd have to get permission from the elders and the leadership for this training. Can we use that word? Because it's a suicide prevention training. And we'd have to get special, they'd have to do ceremony and give us special permissions.
Before we wrap up, are there any more questions or comments for Dr. Zimmerman? Okay. Any last things from you, Dr. Zimmerman?
No, just a pleasure to be with you all. Very honored to be invited to this dialogue, and very exciting to see that work across the nation is happening on behalf of tribes, for tribes, around historical and intergenerational and contemporary primary trauma. So thank you guys.
Well, thank you. We are so honored to have you, and we appreciate you sharing your wisdom and experiences. I hope we can have you back at some point, and I really hope you feel better. It is no fun to, and we appreciate you being here in spite of not feeling well.
Yes, absolutely. My cough syrup worked. So I did not go into a coughing jag. Thanks.
No, you didn't.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Bye. Thank you, everyone. And thanks for attending the dialogue. We'll see you again soon.